Judges 6 opens with the words, "The people of Israel did what was evil from Yahweh's perspective. So Yahweh handed them over to Midyan for 7 years. Midyan exercised power harshly against Israel. And because of Midyan, the people of Israel hid themselves in the mountains, caves, and other safe places." The need to hide in caves was because of that harsh treatment. And yet, that was a strong indictment on Israel. They had yet again turned their backs on Yahweh and failed and fallen into the trap of doing the very things that Yahweh had instructed Moshe should never occur. In verse 3, we again see how, along with Midyan, Amalek also attacked Israel. Now it is important to remember who the people of Amalek were. Amalek himself was the grandson of Jacob's twin brother Esau. Clearly, there was no love lost between the descendants of the twins. So because Israel had yet again turned their backs on Yahweh, he'd handed them over to their closest relatives to be their overlords. A horrible situation. As we considered last week, Israel was small in number at that stage. They were not a great powerful nation as has been suggested by many commentators. Rather, they were a small and insignificant band of people, very insignificant in comparison with Midyan and the Amalekites. Together, they were able to totally dominate and subjugate the 12 separate tribes of Israel. Once again, Israel cries out to Yahweh, and yet again Yahweh takes pity upon his people. This time he raises up a prophet by the name of Gid'on, who reminded them of all that Moshe had instructed and how Yahweh himself had brought them out of bondage in Egypt and settled them into the land that he'd promised. He also reminds them yet again that they had failed to observe the commands by turning away and following false gods. They had ended up in the plight that they were in. So in verses 11 and 12 we read, "The angel of Yahweh came and sat under the pistachio tree at Ophrah, which is 6 miles southeast of Shechem. Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. The angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, 'You valiant hero, Yahweh is with you.'" So who is the angel of Yahweh? Just like Abraham, who entertained 3 visitors, we see here another appearance of the same angel of Yahweh. Over 70 times throughout scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, we encounter the angel of Yahweh. In all references, we see that it's the same character, whom we, of course, know as Yeshua. He was making himself visible as a human being before he came to earth and lived as a human being. So he was appearing as an angel. So we see the angel of Yahweh appears in person to Gideon, giving him the personal confirmation that he had been called, because the angel said, "You are a valiant hero. Yahweh will be with you." Doubtless, the personal encounter was necessary because Gideon, in answer, says to the angel in verse 13, "Excuse me, sir, if Yahweh is with us, then why is all this still happening to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Didn't Yahweh bring us out from Egypt?' Now Yahweh has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midians." Gideon needed personal reassurance that it was actually Yahweh who was speaking. Just to hear the words of Yahweh in a vision would not have been insufficient in that circumstance. So the presence of the angel of Yahweh would be the only way that would really convince Gideon who he was. Because Yahweh then said to him, "I will be with you, and I will strike down Midyan, as easily as if they were just one man. Now the words "as if the Midianites were just one man" was a very tall ask for any person. When we consider the people of Midyan had actually descended from Abraham, from his second wife Keturah, they were now well established 7 generations later. By the time Gideon was being asked to face off against Midyan, Midyan's fighting men would have possibly numbered tens of thousands. So Gideon's response was, "Forgive me, my Lord, but with what am I going to save Israel? Why, my family is the poorest among Manasseh, and I'm the youngest person in my father's house." Gideon's words were a reflection of what Moshe had said to Yahweh at the burning bush, when Yahweh told him to go single-handedly and face off against Pharaoh. His response, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the people out of Egypt?" He didn't think he was capable. Like Moshe before him, Gideon wanted a sign that it really was Yahweh who was speaking to him. So Gideon says in verse 18 and 19, he pleads with the angel not to leave before he prepares a meal for the visitor. That's just like Abraham, his forefather, who prepared the meal for his 3 visitors. This is yet another example of how gracious Yahweh has been towards the prophets that he has called and chosen, who at first, of course, doubt that they are capable of carrying out the task that Yahweh has laid before them. Gideon was no exception. Just like Abraham and Moshe before him, and Eliyahu after him, he pleaded with Yahweh for confirmation that this message truly was from God. Finally, in verse 24, Gideon accepts that it was Yahweh with whom he was speaking, and he builds an altar to Yahweh and calls it Yahweh Shalom in Ophrah, where he had his encounter. So Gideon's first task is to purge the Baal worshippers. That same night, Yahweh instructs Gideon on how to bring an end to Israel's worship of Baal, starting with the destruction of Gideon's own father's altar to Baal. However, the men of the city all ganged up against Gideon for having destroyed the altar of Baal. Such was their love for Baal that they were determined to kill Gideon because of his actions. Finally, it was his own father, Joash, who came to his defense by challenging the men of the city, saying in verse 31, "You're defending Baal, are you? Is it your job to save him? Anyone who defends Baal will be put to death before morning. Baal is a god. Let him defend himself." Gideon was given a title, Yeru Baal, meaning Baal. Let Baal defend. Because Gideon had destroyed the altar, it was a challenge directly to Baal that he himself should really defend himself. But can Baal defend himself? This is again a reflection of the actions of Eliyahu as he stood there against those 450 Baal worshippers. The prophets from Israel made Baal defend himself. But in both situations, the actions spoke louder than words. There is no one who is the true God of the universe apart from Yahweh. That is a lesson that, like Israel, many people in many nations have to learn and will learn at great cost to themselves as individuals and as national groups. Yahweh, as the only true and living God, will never be mocked or held in contempt without dire consequences for the one who denies or rejects Yahweh, and latterly Yeshua. Having confronted and destroyed the forms of worship for Baal, Gideon is then confronting the Midianites. Having proven the falsity of Baal, and having withstood the challenges opposed by his own people, his own city dwellers, and his own family, Gideon was then tasked by Yahweh with confronting the might of Midyan and Amalek. By that stage, the force of Midyan and Amalek had crossed the Jordan and set up camp in the Jezreel valley. So Gideon sounded the shofar and called all the men from the eastern half of Manasseh, who rallied behind him along with others from the tribes of Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. They all joined forces with him in readiness for battle against Midyan and Amalek. Even with increasing support from various tribes, Gideon still found it necessary to put Yahweh to the test. As we read in chapter 6, verse 36 and 37, he said to Yahweh, "If you are going to save Israel through me, as you said you would, then here I will lay a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, while the ground stays dry, I will be convinced that you will save Israel through me, as you said you would." That was a bold action to take after having shown how Yahweh supported him by stamping out the worship of Baal in the community. He was still not satisfied with the result of what he had done. Gideon still needed confirmation. So even laying out the fleece, and it was wet, he wrung a bowl of water out of it. He still lays out a second fleece the next night. A second time he proceeds with the same test. This time for it to be dry while everything else is wet. Asking God for a sign is a dangerous practice. Even during the latter stages of Yeshua's ministry, the Perishim and the Torah teachers challenged Yeshua, "Give us a sign that you truly are the Mashiach we're waiting for." His response, as we read in Matthew chapter 12, where he said, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign? No. No one will be given a sign except the sign of the prophet of Jonah. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the depths of the earth." There are still many people in the 21st century today even put out a fleece, while at the same time ignoring the answer that Yeshua had given in Matthew. Why is the action of putting out the fleece so wrong? It is because there is not one church body that acknowledges Yeshua was actually in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. People who put out fleeces asking for a sign are really involving themselves in a dangerous practice. Regardless of the circumstances, those people that belong to institutions that completely ignore what Yeshua himself said when he gave that sign to that generation are really involving themselves in dangerous practice. And what Yahweh and Yeshua want instead is trust and faith that he will do and is what he said he is. It's because of simple, uncompromising trust, such as Abraham had, that Abraham himself was called a friend of God, as stated or reiterated in James chapter 2, verse 23. Abraham had faith in God, and it was credited to his account as righteousness. He was even called God's friend. Now, coming back to chapter 7 of Judges, we see in verses 1 to 8 how Yahweh turned Gideon's challenge back upon himself. Gideon, having accepted the task Yahweh had presented him, he amassed an army of many men from all the 12 tribes of Israel and gained the confidence of the men that they together would overpower the Midianites. But Yahweh made it known to Gideon that it was Yahweh himself alone who was going to win the battle. Israel were not going to be able to gain victory by their own actions. Yahweh did not want a large army to go into battle on his behalf. The method used to reduce the number of fighting men is quite interesting in itself. The way in which the men drank from the stream determined whether they were suitable as fighting men. as in verse 5 and 6, put to one side everyone who laps up water with his tongue, the way a dog does, and put to the other side anyone who gets down on his knees to drink. 300 lapped up were selected to fight along with Yahweh and Gid'on, but the rest of the men were actually sent back home. Later that same night, Yahweh instructed Gid'on to attack the Midianites. But first, Gid'on, at the suggestion of Yahweh, reconnoitred the enemy, sneaking up to the camp to overhear their conversations. Hearing how fearful the opposition were, Gid'on renewed his confidence and led the charge, but not before falling on his knees to worship before Yahweh. By that stage, Gid'on truly trusted Yahweh and said that he knew that the battle would be won by Yahweh, not himself. Now, what about the cunning plan of Yahweh? In verses 16 and 17, Yahweh shares a cunning plan with Gid'on, who shares it in turn with his leading men. Yahweh instructed that they split into 3 separate groups, and each take a shofar and an empty pitcher containing a torch. Gid'on then instructed them what they were to do. When I and everyone with me, 3 100-man groups, when I blow the shofar, then you are to blow your shofars all around the whole camp and shout, for Yahweh and for Gid'on. Having carried out the instructions given to the 300 men advanced in 3 separate parties, blowing their shofars in one hand and smashing the pitchers with the lights inside in the other. This caused the Midianites to go into a state of complete confusion. They thought it was a huge army that was coming. As verse 22 says, Gideon's men blew their 300 shofars, and Yahweh caused everyone in the camp to attack his own comrades. And the enemy fled beyond Beit She'ah as far as the border. The enemy were in a state of utter confusion and offered no resistance whatsoever. Gideon's 300 men had been armed with just shofars and lighted pitchers. They had no weapons of war. Yet they defeated the enemy without the loss of one Israeli life. By dawn, the enemy forces had completely retreated beyond the border. There have been a number of examples of on various media platforms of how similar events occurred in modern times, particularly during the Six-Day War of 1967, where the Arabs ran away from the Israeli armed forces on more than one occasion. Eyewitness accounts have actually testified that the Arabs saw at least on one occasion a great white army. So they took off their boots and ran through the desert. On another occasion, they saw a larger-than-life image of Father Abraham. They were petrified, but there was only a few Israeli soldiers there. Yahweh can and does protect his people when they really rely upon him and trust him. And he will protect them and guide them. Just like the Midianites facing off against Gid'on, the Arabs in 1967 escaped uninjured when they acknowledged the presence of Yahweh and took off. Once again, peace descended on Israel, and the rest of the life of Gid'on was harmonious. Another chapter in the development of Israel had come to its completion. Now next week, next Shabbat, we will consider how the relationship between Gid'on and the men of Ephraim became one of conflict and unrest that developed not only with them but other tribes of Israel. Without an external enemy to battle with, they started to internalize their own disputes. And so history begins to repeat itself. As we've seen from the book of Judges, Israel had been constantly turning their backs on the ways of Yahweh and turning away from Torah. It caused them unending bondage under external overlords who ruled them harshly, even more harshly in some cases than Pharaoh of Egypt. Each time they cried out to Yahweh, he took pity on them and raised up yet another deliverer or saviour who brought them back into relationship with Yahweh, but only for the natural life of that deliverer. But then, after the death of that leader, they reverted back to the same old ways again. The same pattern occurred many generations later in the days of Eliyahu. There we sing, the king Ahab of the 10 tribes of the north had not only established their own centre of worship away from Jerusalem, but they also had taken upon themselves the practices of Baal worship. It took 3.5 years of famine to finally bring King Ahab to realize the error of his ways. He was following the worshipful practices of his foreign wife, Isra'el. Finally, she brought him into conflict with Eliyahu. Like the judges who had been raised up by Yahweh, Eliyahu himself was tasked with bringing an end to this Baal worship. However, having proved the point on Mount Carmel, with Yahweh having devoured the sacrifice that he presented, instead of letting the Baal prophets go free, because they had acknowledged the fact that Yahweh was God, Eliyahu himself has them all killed. As a result, he needed to escape from the presence of Queen Isra'el, who was determined to kill him also. This is similar to what happened to Gid'on. When he smashed his father's altar to Baal, the people turned on him. So the prophet never has any respect in the midst of his own people. So this again enables us to reflect on the fact that tasks that were given to people in ancient times are just as applicable in this day and age today, and will be right through the 1,000 years. Shabbat Shalom.